Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis with Forbes Breaking News. Joining me now is Dr. Jonathan Schanzer, Senior Vice President at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Dr. Schanzer, thank you so much for joining me today.
My pleasure.
As we sit here right now, we just passed the 5-month mark in the Israel-Hamas war. There have been temporary ceasefire talks, but the war is still ongoing. Can you talk about where we are right now and why there is not a temporary ceasefire yet?
Well, where we are now is that Israel has completed probably 80 to 90% of the hard work in Gaza, at least the way they describe it. They've gone from the north of the coastal enclave to the south. There's one town remaining, that is the town of Rafah. Rafah is literally sitting right on the Egyptian border. The problem for the Israelis is not whether or not they can conquer the town. They think they can. It's really actually a question of the 1.4 million displaced people that have sought shelter there, because as Israel has swept from the north of Gaza to the south, they've pushed the people further south to get away from the fighting. So now that the Israelis want to go into this last town, they're going to need to come up with a way of getting them to a safer place. They would prefer that these people move to the coast where the water table is high enough so that there would be no tunnels that Hamas could use to reach these places. And I think, though, there's other challenges as well. The Israelis, I think, are probably trying to deploy facial recognition software so they can, hopefully from their perspective, flag the Hamas terrorists that are hiding amongst the civilians. But this is going to take some time. And the other thing that I think we need to be aware of here is that we're now in the month of Ramadan. Ramadan is not an excuse for terrorism and violence, but it has been used by Hamas to justify things like that. So the Israelis are trying to be very careful there as well. They don't want to ignite other fronts like in the West Bank or Jerusalem. So right now it appears that we're kind of just at a moment of pause. And that pause, I think, is even more pronounced because we are now watching the U.S. Openly challenge the Israelis on whether they should or shouldn't go into Rafah or when they go into Rafah. So, and I think those things, by the way, are really connected to our political cycle here. The president's base is one that probably doesn't particularly appreciate the fact that this war is even happening in the first place. So there's a big pause here in the fighting. The Israelis, I think, are trying to figure out where to go from here. I think they would like to have a ceasefire, but what we're hearing is that the Hamas leadership, specifically the leadership in Gaza, led primarily by Yahya Sinwar, they are refusing to make a deal. We're hearing that it's complex, that it's ongoing, that the talks are actually still happening, but at least for right now, Hamas is balking at a hostage deal.
Does it look like that would be likely? Because like you said, we just started Ramadan. President Biden has called for a temporary 6-week ceasefire in exchange for the release of hostages, also aid to get into Gaza. Does it look like that ceasefire is going to happen at all?
Look, I think what we're hearing is that the Hamas leadership is not interested right now. Sinwar has said that he has the Israelis right where they want them, which is a strange thing to say when you've lost, 80, 90% of the Gaza Strip. But I think he somehow believes that he may be able to ignite the West Bank, Jerusalem, or maybe even the broader Arab world against Israel during Ramadan. He thinks he can play off of the kind of religious tensions that typically accompany this time of year. That's the complexity as we understand it. I mean, from the Israeli perspective, there are some additional challenges. There were actually reports this morning that one of the hostages that was believed to be alive has now been declared dead. The news is just growing more and more pessimistic about the fate of these hostages. The Israelis are aware that for every day they wait, for every day they don't try to go in and pull them out, that's another day where you have the potential for things to go badly for these hostages who've been held largely underground for the last 5 months under terrible conditions.
I want to get back to that city of Rafah. President Biden, in an interview on MSNBC over the weekend, called an Israeli invasion into Rafah a red line for him. What are your thoughts on those comments?
I have to say, this has been a weird week when it comes to watching this conflict. Because if you recall, the president was, he flew over to Israel. He provided military advisors to the Israelis to try to help them figure out how to handle the problem of Hamas. He continues to call for the release of the hostages, and Hamas refuses to do so. And yet, what he's doing right now is slamming the Israelis for wanting to finish the war that they didn't start, but that they want to finish. And this seems inextricably tied to our election cycle. We saw the president take some pretty clear and somewhat harsh positions as it related to Israel during the State of the Union address last week. We've seen leaks coming out of the White House where they're talking about how Benjamin Netanyahu, that right now his tenure as prime minister, is in danger. It's not to say that that isn't true. I think the Israeli prime minister's tenure has been in danger since 10/7, since that catastrophic intelligence failure. But what's interesting is that the White House is leaking this stuff in the first place. And it really does look like because Israel is not maybe as popular among some constituents within the Democratic Party, the progressives to say the least, maybe also, Michigan voters, and we know that Michigan's going to be a tough battle for the president. It appears that President Biden has taken on some very different rhetoric, really critical of Israel because of electoral considerations. I have to say this is not a great look for the United States. It appears that we're meddling in the affairs of a Democratic ally. I don't think we should be doing that. But then on top of that, the idea that our electoral considerations would begin to bear out in the Middle East as it relates to handling a terrorist organization and defeating a terrorist organization that's designated here in the U.S. It's not as if the Israelis are the ones saying, well, this is a terror group. We say it too. And you'd think that we'd want to wrap this up. And by the way, we'd also probably want to go after the patrons and sponsors of Hamas and to hold them to account. And here I'm talking about the Iranians primarily, but also the Qataris, the Turks. We haven't seen the president say one thing about any of these countries. Instead, we're hearing that Israel is about to cross a red line. So we're certainly watching some strange headlines, to put it mildly.
If we think about how this war started, it started in response to those October 7th attacks that Hamas launched on Israel. And as you know, there have been broad calls for a ceasefire from Democratic lawmakers at the State of the Union to actors at the Oscars. Do you think there's enough pressure or any pressure on Hamas to release the hostages?
The only pressure that is coming right now is the military pressure from the Israelis, if we're to be frank about this. The U.S. is working through the Qataris. That's not true. The Qataris are patrons of Hamas. They've been providing $30 million a month to Hamas, and they give Hamas a headquarters, and they've not kicked out anybody from the country since this thing began. So I don't believe that Hamas has really felt any pressure internationally, diplomatically, politically. They're feeling the pressure in Gaza itself because the Israelis are fighting. And this is... There's a lot of criticism right now about how the Israelis have just been pushing militarily and that they just want to wrap this up and that it's not in everyone's interest to do that. But they're saying, look, if we don't do this, we're not going to get the hostages out at all because no one is squeezing Hamas. Hamas has to know, at least the way they describe it, is that if they don't do this, then they are going to meet a quick end. And that, I think, is the discrepancy right now. I will say that there is some irony, though, to whether it's members of Congress holding up signs during the State of the Union or, actors at the Oscars, directors, etc., calling for an immediate ceasefire. The Israelis have agreed to a ceasefire. The U.S. wants a ceasefire. Everybody wants a ceasefire except for essentially Hamas and their patrons in Iran and perhaps some of their allies like Hezbollah or the Shiite militias in Iraq and Syria or the Houthis in Yemen. I mean, we know what a ceasefire would look like. It would be basically the 40 or 50 hostages that are probably still alive in exchange for several hundred, maybe even more, Hamas prisoners that have been held in jails in Israel, and that these exchanges would take place during Ramadan over the course of a month or 6 weeks. We know exactly what will happen if a deal is struck. Hamas has refused. And that, I think, is lost on Hollywood. It's lost on progressives in Congress. And I think it's lost on, in general, the media here in the United States. It's not as if Israel wanted this war to begin with. And it certainly is not as if Israel wants this to continue right now. They want the hostages back. Eventually, they want to rid the Gaza Strip of Hamas, but they'd be willing to wait if they got a deal.
I do want to talk about President Biden's remarks after he said that red line remark. He immediately followed up with this: "I'm never going to leave Israel. The defense of Israel is still critical. So there's no red line. I'm going to cut off all weapons," meaning there's no red line. He's going to give Israel weapons. But he did add, "You cannot have 30,000 more Palestinians dead." Can you read the tea leaves here? I know you said it's been a weird week. What does this mean for Israel?
Well, I think the Israelis are trying to figure that out. And this is not an easy thing for them. I mean, they are hearing right now that weapons could be halted if they go into Rafah right now. And what they're also hearing is that there's no hostage deal. So what they're being told to do is to just simply wait on their fight until they don't even know what. I mean, is it until the end of Ramadan? Is it until the electoral picture in America becomes a little bit more clear? The terms of this pause have not been, I think, made entirely clear to the Israelis. But what I do know is, watching Israeli TV, reading their commentary, tracking on in the region, the people of Israel, there's 10 million people who want this war over in the south. They want the hard fighting to be done. They want Hamas gone so that they can start to rebuild the southern communities that were destroyed by Hamas on October 7th. This is what they want more than anything else. And the people are now being told that there's tension over the basic war aims of the Israeli government. And so that's what's weird here. Now, I do think the president has walked back some of this. But I will also note that, they continue to talk about Rafah as a red line, which, again, it's the rhetoric is odd because you talk about red lines with adversaries and enemies and those who are directly challenging, the U.S.-led world order. Rarely do you talk about American allies, Democratic allies in this way. What we're hearing, though, is that the primary concern is about the civilians and about getting them to safety. And I think, again, the Israelis are on board with that, but they need to, I think, be reassured that they're still going to get the support that they have been relying upon with the United States. The U.S. is the closest ally that Israel has, and we provide weapons systems. The Israelis don't want to go, and we've asked them not to go, to China, to Russia, to other weapons manufacturers. And you can see that there's tension that's building as a result of this. I don't think the Israelis are going anywhere. They just like to resolve this with the U.S. and to do so quickly.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu did comment on that red line remark, and I want to read that and get your response. He said this, quote, "I have a red line. You know what the red line is. That October 7th doesn't happen again, never happens again." What do you think of this break between President Biden and Prime Minister Netanyahu, as well as he's saying, Netanyahu, that an invasion into Rafah is not a red line for him? President Biden doesn't feel the same way.
Yeah, I mean, look, there again, it's been a weird week, to put it mildly. You've got these two guys, they've known each other for decades now. I don't want to say it's all been great, but it's all not been terrible either. They know each other well. There is a sense right now that I get that maybe both men are to a certain extent. When Biden, attacks Bibi, this plays well with his base. When Bibi says that is fighting for the interests of Israel and to make sure that 10/7 doesn't happen again. That plays well with his base too. And while the Israelis are not in an election cycle right now, we could see one in the near future. There is going to be a moment where the Israelis believe that the hard fighting is done. Hopefully, anyway, this war begins to wrap up, and then they will begin to deal with who was at fault on 10/7. Whether a new government needs to be formed. All these things, I think, are still very much in the offings. But, we're watching these two guys sort of slug it out. And that's not a very positive thing for Israel, for sure. But I also have to say it's probably not a good thing for the United States long term either. I think that our other allies in the region, when I look at the Saudis, for example, they have to be wondering whether an alliance with the United States is something that they can rely on too. Let's just say, for example, that they needed to go to war to defend, against an existential threat. Would the U.S. condition assistance there? They've already seen it happen to them once when they were fighting the Houthis. And now you look at the fact that the U.S. is dealing with the Houthis and the Saudis are sort of saying, I told you so. You knew this was coming, and now we're watching, what you're doing with the Israelis. I don't think this is a great look. I think, by the way, again, the meddling in the electoral politics of a democracy is not a great look. So I've got to say, I think that overall, this is a sort of again, it's a strange time watching this rhetoric play out. In my view, ending this war more quickly would probably help Biden because it would get all of this out of the headlines. It would help the Israelis. And by the way, it might even lead to elections sooner in Israel because, once the war is over, the Israelis will have the time and space to think about politics. Right now, they're not ready.
You said earlier that something that's lost in the dialogue here is that Hamas is refusing a ceasefire deal. Do you think there's anything else missing from the international discourse?
Well, I do. I mean, I think that the entire crisis that we're watching is you can see the fingerprints of Iran everywhere, right? The Iranians armed and trained Hamas. They armed and trained Hezbollah. And of course, Hezbollah continues to fight Israel. They've been launching rockets every day, including about 100 just yesterday or the day before. The Shiite militias that have been attacking the United States and have been sowing mayhem across the region, they're armed and trained by Iran. The Houthis are armed and trained by Iran. And yet I don't see any discussion of whether we're going to change our Iran policy, whether we're going to take a tougher line as it relates to the Iranians. This is something that it's inexplicable to me. I mean, when I look back just even at the State of the Union address, I think there was one, maybe two mentions of Iran in the whole address. And, and meanwhile, like a solid 30 seconds plus a standing ovation as it related to the civilians in Gaza and what Israel could or couldn't do. So, I do think that broader context is truly missing here as we talk about the war.
That's interesting because one of your colleagues, Richard Goldberg, says the same thing to me, that Iran's fingerprints are all over this. When do you think we will have a discussion on our policy with Iran? Do you think that will come before the 2024 election?
I doubt it highly because I think this administration would still like to get into a renewed nuclear deal of some sort along the lines of the 2015 deal that President Obama signed. The problem is that, the terms of that deal are still loosely in effect. And what that's done is it's actually given Iran an advantage here, that they are actually marching closer and closer to the brink of a nuclear weapon. And they're essentially blackmailing the region. All of the mayhem that they are sowing across the region right now, it's designed, I believe, to be really a distraction or even a reinforcement of where they're going on the nuclear program, and maybe a little bit of both for that matter. I mean, we're so focused right now on all of these little tactical challenges all across the region, we've lost sight of the fact that they're moving to a nuke, and they're not even really, they're not hiding it. So we're distracted, but it's all in plain sight. And it's a huge problem, but I think that the desire to get that deal, or to hope against all odds that we can rely on diplomacy as opposed to the threat of force or even the use of force, this is where I think the administration is. They know that additional conflict in the Middle East is not going to be popular, certainly not among the left, not among progressives, but there's obviously a neo-isolationist right wing as well that doesn't want to see the U.S. get more involved in Middle East wars. So you can get a sense right now that the administration is trying to punt this. They're trying to kick the can down the road. I don't know if they're going to be able to be successful if we see more violence on the part of the Iranians. It's funny, but if the Iranians were smart and they wanted another 4 years of Biden and this policy, they might actually try to tamp down some of the violence so that they would have somebody who might still be trying to engage in diplomacy, as opposed to Donald Trump, for example, who, he imposed massive sanctions. He took out Qasem Soleimani, their top general in Iraq back in 2020. You can see that the Iranians do have choices here, but right now it really does look like they are intent on igniting the region, and the month of Ramadan certainly appears to be another opportunity for the Iranians to do so.
You called this a weird week. You said we're in sort of this pause period. What's on your radar? What should we all be looking out for next?
Well, we've got a month of Ramadan here, and there's a lot that can go wrong, not just in Gaza, but in the West Bank and in Jerusalem. There's already been a couple of scuffles between worshippers on the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Israeli police. There have been attempted attacks in the West Bank, and so I would keep an eye out there. I would say, in addition, there's escalation on Israel's northern border, and the Israelis are warning that if things continue to go in this direction, that they may need to take severe action in the north. And I'll just tell you that if there is a war between Hezbollah and Israel, it will be far more grueling than anything that we've seen in Gaza. And it's been pretty grueling in Gaza for the last 5 months. With Hezbollah, they have an arsenal of something like 200,000 rockets instead of 20,000 like Hamas. They have a military that's trained alongside the Russians and the Iranians. They are assessed to have military power akin to a mid-sized European army. And the Israelis would potentially have skyscrapers falling and thousands of casualties, as opposed to the hundreds that we've seen so far in this war with Hamas. So that is a big one to watch. And we continue to really pay attention to the north, because it's not a garden variety war in the Middle East. This has been as tough as it's been, a war in Israel's north would be unlike anything we've seen in the region to date. So those, I'd say, are the two big things to watch. And then there's, of course, the ups and downs of our political system and how that is now having a direct impact on Israeli national security and the broader balance of power in the Middle East. I think that's another one to watch, because looks like positions are hardening as it relates to our political system and the messaging that we're sending abroad.
Dr. Schanzer, I really appreciate your commentary today. As the situation develops, I hope you join me again to break it all down. Thank you so much for joining me.
My pleasure.